Now it's time for today's perspective on the programme, and it is approaching 18 months now since the first protests at the time simply against the war in Gaza were held at Columbia University in New York City. The protests, as we all know, morphed into huge demonstrations, students camping out at the campus amid some violent protests, with many arrested, expressing, though, their free speech and their anger at what was happening halfway around the planet. Now, Columbia has long been known as one of the foremost legal scholars of free expression in the United States, that badge of honour partly constructed by my guest on the programme today. C Bollinger is now President Emeritus of Columbia University. He led the university up until 2023, just before the protests broke out, and he's reflected on what happened after he left and the wider picture of what it means for American universities in his book, University, A Reckoning. And he joins me now in the studio. Great to have you with us.
Thank you very much.
We'll talk about the book in just a moment, but first of all, talk about what you thought and what your impressions were as those protests broke out.
Yeah. Well, as you said, this happened after I stepped down, the year after. You know, anytime there are major events in the country or the world, they're going to be reflected on campuses. Young people almost always feel very intensely. Some young people do, and they manifest that in protests on campus. So this was a period that was very difficult for universities, and Columbia, of course, was at the center of this, as you noted. In general, campuses in the United States embrace the First Amendment as their guide, and that means that protests can take place that involve very, very good ideas, but also very bad ideas. And there are also limits to free speech. And so drawing those lines, was a very difficult and challenging thing for universities. I think that it precipitated some government actions afterwards, which we'll talk about, that really went beyond any kind of direct engagement with the protests and created problems, really, for American civil liberties.
What about the actual management of the university at the time? Do you think they handled it well?
So I have a strict rule of not criticizing my successors, but I think that I've made some points in the book. Free speech is not something that people naturally understand, and it's extremely important that universities always articulate what the values are of free speech and what the limits are. It's also very important to have disciplinary procedures that are in place for speech that goes beyond and actions that go beyond free speech. And all of those things, I think, were not done on university campuses. So it was a problem. I think universities were caught somewhat flat-footed by what happened.
So that introduction that I said about Columbia long being thought of as a university of free speech, do you think that was spoiled by what happened?
I don't think it was spoiled. I do think that whenever you have the police brought in on a campus, that's a traumatic experience for people, even when it's completely justified. So that had really not happened in this degree for many decades, and so it was a stressful moment.
You took what happened and you've written about it in your book and taken the whole theme a lot further as well. First of all, why did you want to write the book?
So the problem is that after Donald Trump was elected president, he and the administration really went on the attack against universities. Universities receive a huge amount of federal funding for medicine research and scientific research, and they suspended that money and demanded that universities change their procedures with respect to student applications, faculty hiring, what are called DEI policies and the like. That was a direct violation of the traditional notions of academic autonomy, academic freedom. The same thing had happened with respect to the press, baseless lawsuits against the press to try to go after opponents. The same thing happened with law firms. The same thing happened with business. So what we're facing in the United States, but it began in part with universities and the press, as it almost always does, or authoritarian level intrusions into traditional notions of freedom of speech and press and civil liberties. And I wanted to write a book that both explained universities and how great they are and why they're great and why their structure is so odd and yet contributes to this greatness. And then I wanted to really analyze the First Amendment and how that should embrace protections for universities in the United States, and then to talk about how universities should respond in the future to these kinds of intrusions.
More right-wing people, of course, would say that they had to come in and do that because the universities are hotbeds of left-wingers, as it were.
Yeah, so that's vastly overdone. And, there are always flaws in universities, just like there are in other sectors, like the press or in politics. Universities are addressing these kinds of questions all the time, but in no way can that justify the government intrusions into traditional notions of academic autonomy. And that's what I wanted to argue in this book.
Do you come to conclusions?
Do I come to conclusions? Absolutely. So I think in the United States, freedom of speech and the First Amendment is one of the most significant, parts of the pillars of American society. And the press over time has been afforded a kind of special standing. I want the same thing to happen for universities, and there are intimations of that. I know in France there are similar kinds of notions, policies about very special protections needed for universities. I want the same thing in the United States. But universities also need to embrace an identity of really being part of the foundational ideas of the country, pursuit of knowledge, pursuit of truth, and also to work collectively. We need a kind of NATO charter with an Article 5 for universities in the United States. If any one is attacked, all of them have to come to the defense. And also cross-sector. We need more resistance to authoritarian moves by law firms, press, business joining together to resist these kinds of moves.
And what about from the students' perspectives? I know you were giving a talk last night at C University here in Paris. You mentioned France before. I mean, France is always known, isn't it, as a place where students are often out on the streets expressing their free expression. I mean, how important do you think it is that students are able to do that?
It's extremely important. I mean, that is the future of the society. We want young people to care about issues, about the life that they will have. Those of us who were born as I was in 1946, went through the 1960s, became a law professor in the 1970s. I mean, this was the essence of changes that happened in the United States with respect to race, with respect to democracy, criminal procedure, freedom of expression. And these were, really not originated, but they were significantly advanced on American campuses. I think the same thing happened in Europe and certainly in France. So we all should want young people to be engaged with issues. There will be excesses, and those have to be addressed. But we can't let the excesses stop us from appreciating and encouraging engagement.
Good to get your views. Thanks very much for coming and talking to us today here on France 24. C Bollinger there, Professor Emeritus of Columbia University. His book, as I said once before, University, A Reckoning. You'll find it, of course, in all good bookshops. Thanks very much for coming in and talking to us here on the programme.